we are going to start with session 43. Today we will be looking into the centurion's confession. Thereafter we will look at the women who were there at the feet of, at the cross, okay, at the feet of Jesus, as John describes. And then we will be looking at the burial of Jesus, especially in particular Joseph of Arimathea. These will be the three main topics that we will cover today. Just give me a moment, let me share my screen. I think everybody can see the screen, right? Okay. So today we begin with session 43. Fortunately, today is also supposed to be a very great solemnity. It is the feast of the exaltation with the Holy Cross. And it is no coincidence that we are right now pondering, okay, at the pivotal moment in Jesus' life and his life and mission when he was dying on the cross, and after he died, the impact that he left behind on the people who were eyewitnesses around the cross at Golgotha, and history that was to follow later. So let us go forward. In last Sunday's session, we have pondered upon how Jesus dies, okay, painfully on the cross, and the torments that he suffered, and how he gives up his spirit, okay, bends his head to the will of his Father. We also pondered on the pathos of his heavenly Father. We often, when we think about the suffering and death of Jesus, we fail to take into account how much God the Father too must have suffered. It is not that he abandoned him at all. He must have been there with him throughout. But the only thing is, the sufferings of Jesus were greatly heightened because of the dark night of the soul that he experienced, which began from Gethsemane and ended up at Golgotha with a triumphant cry of victory. So we have seen how God himself too must have suffered, and in the end, how God vindicates him by the rending of the veil of the temple. We have also looked into the significance of the rending of the veil, what implications it has had. Okay, it was a direct act of anger on the part of God to show, okay, his reaction to the way his son was put to death by the murderous clan of all the high priests there in Jerusalem. Today we go forward and we contemplate on the confession that was made by the centurion, the first Gentile who was eyewitness testimony to how Jesus died on the cross. Let us have a look. We read out on the chapter 15 of Mark's Gospel. Now when the centurion who stood facing Jesus, saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." So this is what we will, in the coming slides, we will ponder upon this. The women who were standing at a distance, okay, we will look into that later. So repeating the text from the Gospel, and the centurion and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." So this is the confession that the centurion made of all the people who were surrounding Jesus at the foot of the cross. This was one man who was a Gentile, okay, who comes with his public profession of the divinity of Jesus. And how does he come to this faith? Had he ever met Jesus? Did he know him? Possibly never. That was the first time he comes across Jesus, okay, being the head of the execution squad. But Mark very subtly he mentions this, saw that in this way, in these three words, okay, in this way, the way in which Jesus died, it must have left a very deep impression on the mind and heart of this man, who was no Jew, okay, he was no Jew, he was a Gentile, he was a Roman soldier, and definitely centurions did not come from the ranks of the Syrians or, the other people from the provinces. People who were drawn from the provinces to serve in the army, they made up the auxiliary force, to be a centurion and to be a full-fledged Roman soldier, a member of the legionaries, in order to be a legionnaire, you had to be a Roman citizen. So we can be absolutely certain that this centurion was overseeing, okay, the execution squad, okay, called the Carnifex Serarum, as we have seen in last Sunday's session. He has witnessed how Jesus suffered. He must have probably definitely been at the Praetorium when all the Roman soldiers, the entire cohort, was assembled, and they took part in that royal mockery that they made of Jesus. So definitely from that time on, maybe even at the time of the scourging, he has been an important eyewitness watching this man. He must have seen many crucifixions before, but the way Jesus conducted himself, his noble demeanor, must have left a very lasting impression on this man. It is not simply at all that he comes to this, great confession of faith he makes at this point of time in Jesus' life. The centurion was a Carnifex Serarum, okay, the chief executioner who oversaw the crucifixion of Jesus. As we have seen time and again, the execution squad would normally comprise just 4 to 5 Roman soldiers, not more than that. So, as the Carnifex Serarum, okay, the centurion may have presided over such crucifixions in the past, especially if he had served in any provinces in the Roman Empire. We know that the Roman Empire was vast. They had provinces in the west, they had even more provinces in the eastern part. And the eastern provinces were supposed to be very restless provinces where there used to be constant outbreaks of small and big revolts, as we have seen in the Great Jewish Revolt also later. So, being a centurion, definitely this was not his first time experience of having to oversee an execution taking place, a crucifixion. So, he must have been a person who must have been quite hardcore by this time, a very, very hardened core. Normally, when soldiers, when they are exposed to, constant, consistent brutality over a long period of time, they automatically develop something what psychologists call a commodity, an indifference to such brutality, the bloodletting, the suffering, the cries of, the agonized cries of the people dying, normally will not have any impact on such people because this is their daily routine work. And yet, this centurion coming to this faith, it forces us to take a few steps back and peep into a deep sort of a well to see from where this confession actually comes about. So at least in Palestine we know, okay, at the time when Jesus was a young man, crucifixions had very much, slowed down, literally declined. And especially during the governorship of Pilate, which lasted almost a decade, a little less than 10 years, there were no recorded crucifixions in Palestine. Like, the other governors and all would carry out, even his successors and all, there were a number of crucifixions. But during the time of Pilate, which was the time when Jesus' ministry was at its peak, there were not many recorded crucifixions. So maybe those were not very common at that time. But we do not know from where the centurion had come, whether he was permanently, garrisoned maybe in Jerusalem, maybe he was drawn from the regions in Syria, or maybe he was permanently stationed at Caesarea. We do not know. So we don't know what was the moral compass of this man at this point of time. Yet he comes full circle, okay, with something that stirs him from within his depths. Crucifixions in Palestine had peaked during the violent times of Herod the Great's reign. We have seen Herod the Great was extremely cruel. Not only did he round up all these bandits and all, especially the zealots were his prime target. He would round them up. So all these people who were viewed as troublemakers, he would just, crucify them wholesale because he had full support of Rome. We also know one of the Hasmonean kings, finally the last ones, Antigonus. When he was defeated, when Herod was taking the throne, he was crucified. In fact, part of his remains have been excavated in Jerusalem. So the overall picture was, at this point of time, not many crucifixions were taking place. But whatever the case, this man was a man who dealt with, this type of violence on probably not a daily basis, we would say, but this was something very common in his life. We do not know how old this man was, whether he was a young centurion, whether he was middle aged, whether he was old, we have nothing. Mark tells us nothing about him. As he witnessed Jesus dying on the cross, we don't know what was his age. But early Christian traditions, a lot of traditions were going around, and that's how we have the culmination of all those things. We have the Gospels and many other New Testament writings, and those which have not made into the canon also. So there are plenty of early Christian traditions which say that his name was probably Longinus. So the very name suggests that he was a full-fledged Roman. So this man must have been deeply moved by the edifying conduct of Jesus on the cross. Despite the mockeries hurled, the cruel taunts from all around, there were taunts coming thick and fast, flying all around. But Jesus, we know that he did not respond to the taunts. He just suffered that in great agony, and finally he just calls out to his Father, my God, my God. So he is witnessing all this. He is seeing the cruelty of the people around him. His own people, the Jews, are there making mockery. It is not the soldiers who are mocking Jesus at this point of time. So he is an eyewitness. He can see these things, unraveling around him. And yet Jesus, the way he dies, there's extreme, nobility, sort of a majesty around him. Crucified criminals normally, when they wish to be, when they were dying, they would hurl abuses at their tormentors when they were in great anguish. But Jesus, far from squirming and abusing in delirium, because this is the time as they are dying, because we know they have to put a weight of their whole body on the nails, okay, on their feet and come up. So it was excruciating, and finally with asphyxiation they would die. So in those last moments, they would literally lose their mind and go in a sort of a delirium. And at that time, this is the peak when they would hurl lots of abuses at their tormentors. This was normally attested to the behavior of crucified criminals. But Jesus, far from abusing his tormentors, he prayed, and he kept praying. And this edifying conduct of Jesus on the cross must have appeared very surreal to the centurion. This was something very out of the world. A normal human being would not behave like this, would not give, though he gave vent to his agony, he did not, decry his tormentors, he did not, hurl down abuses on them, nothing of that sort. On the contrary, he prayed. And if we are to believe Luke's accounts, he even prayed for his enemies. Okay? So this whole thing must have appeared very surreal to him and left a deep dent on his heart with deep respect and reverence for the dying Jesus. This is a picture of the Shroud of Turin. This is believed to be the burial cloth of Jesus. By most Christians, we do believe that this is the genuine burial cloth of Jesus. And the Shroud of Turin today is, it is a hotspot of great scientific investigation. Teams and teams of people have been studying, and of late, these studies have greatly accelerated, giving a very scientific spin to the whole thing. The way the image has come to be made on that, it is, humanly speaking, earthly wise, it is impossible, because it looks to be a radiation, a form of radiation by which the body's imprint has been left. And this we came to know about this only a few years ago, that is in the 20th century, late 20th century. There was one particular Italian photographer Secondo Pia, who, when he took those photographs for the first time, he was allowed to take photographs of the shroud. When he developed the negatives, he was startled to see, okay, the negatives showed, okay, the outline of a man. And ever since, like, the shroud of Turin has become a topic of great scientific investigations all over the world. People, in fact, those who don't belong to the Christian faith, they are the ones who have testified to the authenticity of the shroud. So, only one particular aspect of the shroud I would like to bring in today's session. When DNA studies, lots of DNA studies have been done on the shroud. Okay, so much so that if we believe that this is the shroud of Turin, Jesus' blood group also was AB. Okay, something quite rare. So we know the height, of the man who was wrapped in the shroud or whatever. So one particular aspect of the scientific study that was brought out is when this shroud of Turin was examined, okay, they have confirmed this red color blotches that you can see here, they appear to be brown, but in reality it is quite a dark red, which is very, very rare. You will see, sometimes, like, when we wipe blood, like you have a bleeding wound and you wipe it with a piece of cloth and you keep it over some time, it turns that, reddish brown color. But these blotches that are there of blood, okay, they are a deep red. And from where does this redness come? They say the redness was from excessive amount of bilirubin and creatinine in the blood stains. So when does bilirubin and creatinine peak in the blood? It is when a person, okay, is under extreme pain and torture, okay, the body automatically releases great amounts of bilirubin in the blood, and that is why the shroud becomes a testament to the great amount of suffering that Jesus underwent. Okay, so much so that even today the redness remains, the traces of bilirubin that were unleashed in his bloodstream because of the suffering that he endured. This has remained for eternity. Okay, this explains the unusually bright red color of the bloodstains on the shroud of Turin, despite more than 2000 years having passed by. This is one of the biggest mysteries of the shroud. So why I'm putting this out? He must have seen from the beginning till the end. The centurion has witnessed how Jesus was tortured, the amount, the height, and the depth of that brutality that he endured, and yet that noble, the way Jesus conducted himself, that was something like a normal human being would definitely not be able to take in his or her stride. And that is why the centurion was an eyewitness to the brutality Jesus was subjected to. And the strikingly noble demeanor of Jesus made a deep impression, which made him the first confessor and the first Gentile to affirm the divinity of Jesus. How remarkable this is, no? It is not among those women who were there at the cross, the disciples who had fled. It was not from the disciples that this proclamation of faith comes, but comes from the most unexpected quarters, that too from a Gentile. The Jews around, they should have been better, disposed to believe that Jesus could be the Messiah and the true Son of God. But no, it was a Gentile who witnessed, okay, the tragedy that was unfolding on Golgotha, who became the first confessor among all of us and the first Gentile to affirm Jesus' divinity, that truly he was the Son of God, because a man who was not out of the ordinary would not be able to take such pain and torture in his stride. In Mark's Gospel, at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, okay, we have the heavens rent. Remember at the baptism of Jesus, when Jesus is about to begin his public ministry, he is baptized by John in the waters of the Jordan. And at that time, what do we see? This is all in chapter 1 of Mark. We have seen the heavens rent and God himself, the voice of God coming, affirming that this is my son. Okay, not that he tells, it's not in third person, you are my beloved son in whom I am well pleased. So with the heavens were rent and God, okay, the Father himself affirms that Jesus is his divine son, affirms Jesus' divine sonship. And what we see at the end of Jesus's mission, this was at the start of the mission, we had this affirmation coming from God the Father. And at the end of Jesus's mission, which is, ending at Jesus's death after his crucifixion, we have a Gentile affirm the same eternal truth. So through this pivotal moment, this is a very pivotal moment, and it's not simply for without intention that Mark has laid out his narrative this way. There is a definite theological deep meaning behind it. So just as the ministry of Jesus begins with God the Father affirming him as his beloved son, okay, here you have this centurion on behalf of humanity affirming this eternal truth. So through this pivotal moment, Mark's gospel comes full circle with the opening programmatic proclamation. You remember how the Gospel of Mark begins? The Gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. So this is like Mark comes from where he started, he comes full circle with the affirmation and the confession of this man, the centurion, okay, on behalf of all of us, knowingly, unknowingly, he became the first witness to the divinity of Christ. Now, in connection with this, let me take you in recent times, okay, and I will explain to you the purpose of why I am sharing these slides with you. There's something called this famous Megiddo mosaic. This Megiddo mosaic was a mosaic that was discovered during excavations. In fact, it was not a scientific excavation which is normally taken by the archaeologists. It happened to be an enlarging of the prison in northern Israel called at a place called Megiddo. So it was a place where the prisoners were working. So as they were digging in order to enlarge the prison, because the prisoners in the prison are put to work. So these prisoners, when they were excavating, the earthworks were being carried out in order to enlarge the prison, they came across a very startling discovery. In fact, this is hailed as the greatest discovery in the Bible in the 21st century, because we remember all the while it is always the Dead Sea Scrolls that are considered to be the greatest archaeological discovery of recent times, and nothing can compare to that. But in Christian studies, in the history of Christianity, this particular mosaic plays a very, very important role. And why? We will see this. It is a significant 3rd century AD mosaic floor discovered beneath a prison in Israel at a place called Megiddo. Megiddo is the same place in the book of Revelation is called Armageddon. That is supposed to be the place where finally the final battle between good and evil will be played out. So here at this place, this was discovered. It is believed to be from one of the earliest Christian churches in the world. In fact, if we go by historical timeline, this is not only the earliest, it is the earliest. Decorated with geometric patterns, which I'll just put out the pictures also for you. There are geometric patterns, there are fish, the symbol of these two fish became very iconic, and this became a hidden symbol to identify Christians, because remember, this was also the period before Constantine, before Constantine's conversion. So the first 2.5 centuries were the centuries most of the time where Christian persecution was quite periodically carried out. There were altogether 10 great persecutions. Of them, 2 were the greatest. In fact, not even Nero's is considered to be the harshest one. There was something called the Dacian persecution and the Diocletian persecutions. Both of them, Decius was the emperor who was totally against the Christians. So the biggest number of Christian martyrs suffered during the time of Decius, and soon followed by Diocletian, which was even as worse as Dacian persecution. And this mosaic is around that time. Okay. And where is it found? I've already told you it is in Megiddo, and the dating of that mosaic is more or less based on all the pottery and ceramics and coinage, and the way the inscriptions are, those engravings are carried out and all. scientists and archaeologists, they know how to date, based especially on pottery, they come to correct dating. Sometimes they also indulge in something called carbon dating, which helps them ascertain the correct age when that particular, those material remains were of which particular period. Well, now, what is the significance of this mosaic and why am I telling you this? This mosaic offers direct physical evidence of early Christian beliefs and worship practices, including the divinity of Jesus Christ, a concept not fully developed in mainstream Christian theology until later, in fact, much later. The first later on, no, in 325 AD and all, almost a century and a half later, all these, this theological debates about the divinity of Jesus, whether he was really the Son of God, was he fully divine, was he fully human, all these theological debates intensified soon after Constantine's conversion. And we have this famous Council of Nicaea, which is like a watershed moment in Christian history, which took place in 325, and the whole debate was centered on the divinity of Jesus. There was a faction which believed that he was divine, no doubt, but not fully divine like his father. So these controversies raged, but this mosaic, it testifies to a faith which was already alive and active much before Constantine comes on the scene, and much more. The biggest strong testimony about this is that despite the persecution, we often tend to view the Romans as being very cruel, and the way they would kill the Christian martyrs, how they would be thrown in the arenas to the animals, sometimes in gladiatorial combats or whatever, sometimes crucified. All these things we always imagine, we have grown up imagining, the cruelty of the Roman Empire. And when we imagine the cruelty of the Roman Empire, what really comes to our mind is first and foremost the image of the Roman soldier. But this mosaic, it tells us something very remarkable. It tells us that this mosaic, it was funded by a Roman centurion, and that is the reason I'm drawing the connection over here. Okay. It shows that Romans and early Christians coexisted, with inscriptions noting a Roman centurion who sponsored the mosaic. And the name of the Roman centurion who sponsored the mosaic, this is only part of it. Can you see these two fishes? This became the iconic symbol, to symbolize, to identify Christians, because they couldn't openly practice their faith. They were liable to be persecuted. So it was a hidden practice to congregate together to worship Jesus. They had to do it in the quiet and in secret. So house churches or communities, meeting in homes was common practice at that point of time. It is only when later on, when Christianity became a legit religion under Constantine, they had the freedom to openly practice their faith. But this mosaic testifies that even at the time, around 230 and earlier, already there were strong Christian communities, that were rooted in the belief that Jesus was indeed the Son of God. Because in this whole mosaic was on a table, a sort of a table. So this appears to be a table, a fellowship table where worship was carried out. There was breaking of bread. So there was a community. It is an evidence that a community of faith was congregating over here. So this mosaic becomes a very rich symbol, of early Christian faith. The mosaic features a central table for communion and a depiction of two fish, an early Christian symbol representing Jesus Christ, Son of God, as Savior. This was called, this was a symbol. There was a hidden meaning. There is a big story behind this, which I will not be able to go into, because I will be digressing from the main this later on, when we will be doing the history of the early church in the Acts of the Apostles. That time I will be dwelling in depth about this. And this currently, in fact, it is in June, in just 2 months back, June, July, there was a big exhibition of this mosaic that was going on in Washington, D.C. at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. This is the whole picture of it, This is one archaeological discovery that seems to demonstrate the community of Christians near this Roman outpost of Legio. Now, this place, Megiddo, was not called Megiddo at that point of time. It was called Legio. It is a place which is, very close to the southwest Galilee region. Okay, this place in northern Israel, living out the ideal described in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. Yes, an artist, a soldier, and a philanthropist walked into a room joined by the common mission to create a place for Jesus to be worshipped as God. Okay, so this is the whole thing, the way it is exhibited. Okay, it was in America during the last 2 months. This was how it looked. Of all the amazing discoveries in this relatively small space, this appellation, God Jesus Christ, is truly stunning. The major councils of the early church, as I said, the Council of Nicaea in AD 325, was still decades away in the future. Yet, okay, a century and a half earlier, the faith was actively demonstrated in these spaces of communal worship. This is the aerial view of the whole thing, okay, aerial view of the Megiddo mosaic with a base for the table set at the center. This is how, okay, this is the place when the people have studied, okay, in the exhibition, all these things were displayed. It was created. We know who was the man, who was the artist who brought this mosaic together. Look at the rich decorative work the artist has assembled together. And this was something which was part of Rome's culture, decorating beautiful buildings with mosaics and all. This normally used to happen in the homes and the palaces of the rich and the mighty. So here in the church also places of communal worship, an artist was hired, and we know what was the name of that man, Grotius, because his name is mentioned here. Okay, who was more of an artist than a laborer. He was not merely a hand who was hired in order to do up this mosaic. So definitely he was an artist. And what is the stunning part of this whole mosaic is the names of the people who appear over here. Okay, we already know that it was a centurion who funded it, but the maker of this mosaic was Brutius. This is the inscription what is being mentioned over here. The inscription highlighted above reads, Brutius has carried out the work. Okay, his name appears over here. And on this mosaic, you can see all these motifs, geometric patterns, the two fish, which came to symbolize the early Christian faith. So all these were there. Okay, and what was even surprising was in this mosaic, there were no other graven images of animals and all, because this was normally a prohibition which was practiced as per biblical law. So the only thing that is used over here are these two fish symbols, because they remind us about the story of the loaves and two fishes in the gospel, the miracle that Jesus had conducted. So this symbol of the two fish became symbolic, okay, of Christians. It became a symbol of those who belong to the Christian community. We'll go further. Again, okay, if you go reading, the whole inscription is over here and at another place. So who provided the funds for this room? Okay, for this whole room is some 500 square meters. So in this 500 square meters of communal space, we have this beautiful mosaic, which is a testament to the history of the early church. And so the one who funded obviously was this centurion named Gaius. So he, being a centurion, he was the head of maybe probably of the Roman colony that was stationed over there, the Roman legion there at the location at Legio. So at the time of the Romans, this location was not known as Megiddo, but it was known as Legio. And this Legio was a major junction point where the highways used to intersect those that went from Egypt to Europe and Asia. So it was a huge, big, a route of international importance where there was tremendous exchange of trade that was going on. And we have to remember, often we think that it is, when we ponder on how Christianity came to, spread about, and how did it have such a huge impact that the whole empire came to become Christian. It is not not only it is not so much on a conversion of Constantine, no doubt was a very huge watershed moment in Christian history, but much before that, the testimony of the martyrs, the way they lived, the way they died, but much more, I think, it was the tradesmen, it was the Roman army also. Today, the studies are intensely supporting the idea that it was through, the Roman army, because the soldiers used to be moved from one province to another. And we know the provinces were far spread out. So imagine today archaeological finds in England show us that there were Syrian soldiers, okay, who were stationed in London at that point of time. So you can see the movement of troops from one province to another. In Italy, there have been so many excavated sites that show that the auxiliaries and the soldiers hailed from the Syrian provinces and the provinces of the east. So there was a major flow to and flow of the movement of troops. So definitely the ideas must have carried forward. At the time, the Romans have already seen. Gaius' partner in funding the decorations of this room was another member of the community, a woman called Ekeptos. Now this name is described as a Latin name but adapted into Greek. Nothing is known about this woman, we do not know, but the very name, the very fact that her name was inscribed on this stone over here in this mosaic, it attests to the fact that she must have been a very important community of Christians in that region. And we do not know whether she hailed from the Roman colony that was stationed over there. Must be because the Roman soldiers were allowed to bring their families. They were given sometimes lands and all to settle down, to establish colonies. So probably we do not know whether she was a member of a Roman colony or whether she was a local woman. But whatever, not only she, Ekeptos, the one who donated the table, because the inscription here, when you read, okay, here it has been sort of raised up. So, and the meaning of the inscription is explained here. It reads, Gaius, also called Porphyrius, centurion, our brother. Remember this word, our brother. This was a common connotation that was used for members of Christian community. They would address each other as brother and sister, which was something very unique to the Christian communities. Okay, has made the mosaic at his own expense as an act of generosity. Why would he fund this mosaic if he himself was not a member of the community? So Brutius has carried out the work, and the inscription continues. So we have the name of Brutius inscribed. We know Ekeptos was an important woman who was there, part of the community, and the funding has come from the Roman centurion Gaius. So her name, Ekeptos, has been a person who is described as a God-fearing person. They were called Theosophies. Sometimes they were called Theophilus. Okay, somebody who loves God. These two words, then when they are brought together, it gives you that meaning. So she was a God-loving person. That is the way she was described in the community. And along with her, there were 4 other women also identified and named in the inscription. And this is the most important part of the table. Okay, her name is highlighted over here, Ekeptos. Okay, that she is the one who's the donor of this table where communal worship and probably breaking of the bread happened. And the inscription reads, the God-loving Ekeptos, see the way how she is described, has offered the table to God Jesus Christ as a memorial. Okay, so this is like an eternal testament that she has been the donor of this beautiful table. So the Megiddo mosaic offers tantalizing proof that Christian faith had taken root in the Roman army much before Constantine's conversion. After the destruction, we know after the destruction of Jerusalem temple in 70 AD, there were 2 legions, okay, 6 Ferrata and 10 Cretenses. Each of this legion, the Roman army across the empire more or less had around 15 legions, okay, in the east and 15 to serve in the west. So a total of around 30 legions comprise the Roman army. So these legions, each legion more or less comprised of 600 soldiers. So 600 plus 600, 1,200 soldiers we know were permanently garrisoned in Jerusalem after the fall of the temple. And much after the Bar Kokhba revolt later on in 132 to 135, Hadrian came down, crushing this revolt, and he banned all the Jews. Nobody was allowed to enter in Jerusalem. And there on the ruins of that city, he built his famous new city called the Aelia Capitolina, which we have already seen. And when he converted Jerusalem into Aelia Capitolina, we know that he also brought in the third legion, which also became a part of these three legions that became permanent Roman soldiers colonies in Palestine. So could these Roman army camps be the origins of Christian faith amongst the Roman soldiers? Because today, Bible scholars, archaeologists, and all are very much convinced that this was one of the most important channels through which the Christian faith, traveled from one place to another, and that's how we had, a great, strength of the Christian faith, coming out in big numbers with big Christian communities, though they were facing a lot of persecution. In secret, the communities were building up. So Kuda centurion Longinus, if you would like to believe that it is him, be instrumental in planting belief in Jesus amongst his comrades? I definitely would like to think. Imagine when you have been so much impacted by what you have seen there, on that hill and Jesus died. Do you think, he must just put yourself in his shoes and imagine for yourself, would you remain quiet and silent? Would it not bring about a very great change, maybe in your character, in your personality, and something that has been so life-turning for you? Would you not go and proclaim it to others? It is very nice if we, take some time and just ponder upon this, because this is likely what must have happened, and that is a reason we can see a big number of Roman soldiers, embracing the Christian faith, but in secret. We also have many of the Roman soldiers who turned out to be martyrs. Okay, so Christian history does testify to this fact. So this is the reason. Okay, I bring this important discovery of the Megiddo mosaic, because it will give you the connection how this one man must have brought about, a big change in his own comrades too. Now we move forward. Okay, let us have a look at the women who were there at the foot of the cross. So there were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the Younger and of Joseph, and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee. And there were many other women who had come up with the women who were there at the foot of the cross. And I had with the purpose put only 4 women. This picture, because this is, if we analyze all the gospel accounts and make a comparative study, probably it was 4, at least minimum 4 and maybe more. But minimum 4 we can be absolutely sure about. Let us see how. We have the women until the end. Mark, chapter 15, 40 to 41 is telling us in these two verses. But let us do a little reflection about, how these women who have been observing the whole thing, like how Jesus suffered and died on the cross, they are doing this all from a distance. And why Mark is, taking the trouble to mention them and bring them into the passion narrative. There's a purpose behind it. We have the women, and they are there until the end. Here are the valiant ones who never failed. They stuck with Jesus until the end. And this was what was expected of a disciple. And this was a role that they fulfilled till the end. They did not leave Jesus. He was within their sight. It was safer for them to get near the cross. We have to keep this important factor in mind. Compared to the male disciples, it was much safer for them to get near the cross, especially the women relatives. Okay, But for the male disciples, it would have been difficult. Why? Because they would be considered a threat for following their master. We have to remember that Jesus finally, he was crucified, okay, he was handed down the death penalty, okay, which is called the maestas. What is that? Treason. Jesus, the Roman penalty, okay, for treason was death. A person who is considered an enemy of the state, one who rebels against Caesar, one who makes the claim to be Caesar, is a man against Caesar. So that was a maestas, that was a treason, that was a charge that was brought against Jesus, and for which he was condemned to die. So we have to remember that if these male disciples had to drop near the cross, they definitely would have been caught by the Roman soldiers, because they know that their master has been condemned on the charge, and they also would have been viewed as people who would bring about some trouble because their master is being put to death, because this normally happened in the riots that would take place sometime. However, Mark wants to emphasize, so no doubt this fact is there, that the male disciples definitely could not draw near the cross. They were afraid. And for the women, compared to them, was relatively easier. But Mark wants to emphasize here that all the heroes have left us down. But here are some still standing to the very end. They have been faithful, so we can get our hopes high with these women. They are offered as models to emulate. So Mark, when he's specifically mentioning 3 of them in particular, he's offering them as models, because remember, earlier in the narrative we have also seen a faithful woman who anointed Jesus. Okay, when the passion narrative, it opens only with a faithful woman anointing his feet, whom we call Mary of Bethany, if you believe that. Okay, anointing him with pure nard. So Mark is especially highlighting this, that how the women disciples fare much better than the male ones. We have to also think about Peter's mother-in-law. Very early on in the narrative, she was healed by Jesus, and the moment she became all right, that fever left her, she began to serve them. She began to wait on them. Like normally at a restaurant, when we have waiters waiting on us, what are they doing? They are actually performing table service for us. So Peter's mother-in-law, performed this role, and that became a sort of a role model for the other women who followed Jesus. And we know that Mark tells us there were many other women also along with Jesus who were there at the foot of the cross, who followed him to Jerusalem, and they also supported Jesus out of their means. An insight which normally Luke gives further detail about. We can today, archaeology proves that Mary Magdalene, the later church tradition somehow has confused Mary Magdalene to be the sinful woman, but she was not at all the sinful woman. She was in fact the apostle to the apostles. She was a leader among the apostolic community, a fact which we cannot overlook. And she was a woman of means, because the place from where she came, Magdala, was a very flourishing port, port town. We may not call it a city. So she was definitely a woman of means. There was another, the wife of Shusha, Joanna. She also was a person of means. So they actively supported Jesus in his ministry. So if you use your imagination, I'm sure they must have been among his disciples, the women who followed him, and they were there when the last days of Jesus were played out in his life. They are fulfilling the roles of a disciple, following him up to the cross. So they are doing better than the male disciples, not hiding somewhere. So we have somebody we can look up to. So Mark offers them to us as models to emulate. Matthew and Mark, now who were the people? Who were the women at the cross? Let us have a look at this. Matthew and Mark speak of many women present at the crucifixion, but mention only 3 by name at the death of Jesus and 2 at his burial. First, they say many women were there, but when they are being named, only 3 are named at the foot of the cross and 2 present at his burial. Matthew describes the 3rd individual present at the death, which no other evangelist mentions, as the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Who were the sons of Zebedee? James and John. And so Matthew is the only evangelist who adds this woman among the group of women at the cross without naming her, of course. Okay, he tells us that Mary, the mother of, not Mary, I mean, the mother of the sons of Zebedee, she was also present among the women, but does not tell her, does not give us her name. Mark's third individual is called Salome. Luke mentions none individually. I put out a table, for cross comparison that will make you understand much better. And when we come to John, okay, Luke is totally silent. He doesn't mention who were the women, no names are given. John mentions 4 individually, including the mother of Jesus, who is not mentioned by the other Gospels. This title, okay, with this title, the mother of Jesus is not mentioned in the synoptics except in the Gospel of John. And besides this telling hint, he gives another one also of another woman, okay, which I put out in the next slide, Mary of Clopas. So Mark, Matthew and Luke all place the women at a distance. They are far off because they wouldn't be allowed very close, the disciples having fled. Whereas John, okay, the synoptics tell us that they were, watching from afar, from a distance. But John tells us that they were at the foot of the cross. And that's how we have this, very abiding image in Christian art of Mary at the foot of the cross along with the beloved disciple. So this mention of Mary being at the foot of the cross with the other women is only found in John's Gospel. Now this is the table that I have put out. When you compare the women at the cross, okay, a cross comparison in all the 4 Gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, I have put out a color coding for you to understand that probably these are the same people. Like for example, Mary, mother of Jesus, who mentions it? Only John mentions it. Okay, neither Matthew, Mark, Luke tell us that Mary, mother of Jesus, was among the women at the cross. When it comes to Mary Magdalene, Matthew and Mark mention her. Luke does not mention her, but he doesn't mention any of the women. Okay, John also mentions Mary Magdalene. So 3 of them, okay, they mention Mary Magdalene. Mary, mother of James and Joseph, is mentioned by Matthew and Mark, not mentioned in Luke. Again, we have to take into account Luke doesn't mention anybody at all, but not mentioned in John either. Okay, Mary, mother of James and Joseph, is not mentioned by John. Mother of the sons of Zebedee, only Matthew, none of the others. Salome, mentioned only by Mark, not mentioned by any of the rest of the 3 evangelists. And John has something very peculiar, which none of the 3 evangelists, have it. A sister of Mary, mother of Jesus, okay, that is mentioned by John, and he also mentions Mary of Clopas, okay, not mentioned by any of them. So the likelihood is when you compare, when you look at the names, okay, with the evangelists, when we know that for the core, the kernel of the entire passion narrative, there was one single thing that was circulating, based on which the entire narratives were built around. So could it be that these were all these descriptions were all muddled, they were confused by the evangelist? No, it is not likely that way. We only should know how to analyze them. When we talk about Mary, mother of Jesus, not being present in the synoptics, it doesn't mean that she is not there among the women. She is most likely, okay, appearing in this description of Mary, mother of James and Joseph, because remember, Mark tells us this was Jesus' immediate family. James, okay, Joseph, Jude, okay, and plus he had 2 sisters. So they were all together, around 7 or 5 of them. Yes, 5 of them all together. So when this description is given, okay, over here, they are likely referring to the mother of Jesus. Okay, so this and this is particular one, the same person. Mary Magdalene is all alone over here because she's mentioned in Matthew, Mark and John as well. Mother of the sons of Zebedee and Salome likely is one and the same individual, okay, who is reported only by Matthew over here, and Mark mentions her as Salome. So maybe she is the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Now coming to Mary, okay, mother of Jesus, a sister of Mother Mary. Mary of Clopas, we know from early Christian records that Clopas was supposed to be a brother or a cousin brother of Joseph, Saint Joseph. So likely Mary, okay, of Clopas was a sister-in-law of Mary, Mother Mary, okay. So it is the same person who is being identified here by John. So when he is mentioning a sister of Mary, mother of Jesus, and then again he said Mary of Clopas, likely to be the same individual. So by color coding, if we count the persons being identified here, the women, it is blue is 1, so you have 1, you have 2, you have 3, and you have 4. So 4 of these women, we can be very certain they were there at the near the cross when Jesus was dying. So these women at the cross are offered as models to emulate. They didn't abandon Jesus. They stood faithful till the end, and they were likely 4 plus women at the cross, because Mark tells us that many women followed, so we cannot be very sure whether it was only these 4 who were there or more were there standing, still farther away. We can only make a guess or speculate about that. We go ahead now with the burial of Jesus. When evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate wondered if he were already dead. He was quite surprised that Jesus died so early, okay, within 3 hours. And summoning the centurion, he asked him. So he confirmed before he could, hand over Jesus' body. He called the centurion, the same centurion who has already testified to the divinity of Jesus, confirmed Jesus' death and grants the permission to Joseph. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph bought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. And Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid. So here we can see that it was Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene. They were watching from afar where he was laid, okay, which tomb he was laid, as Joseph of Arimathea was busy making preparations for his burial. It's the same thing. Now let us analyze. In the Roman world, bodies of crucified victims would just be left to rot there, and then they would be thrown into a common grave as a warning for everybody. So this was normal Roman practice. If you were crucified, okay, there were cases like, we know from history that Emperor Tiberius, when he gave the order that Sejanus, okay, the patron of Pilate, whom we have seen earlier in our sessions, okay, when he came with the final order that Sejanus has to be, when he wanted to condemn him to death, even his relatives were condemned to die, and not only that, his other relatives who wanted, to take hold of the bodies, they were denied, and the bodies were just thrown in the Tiber River. So this was the way, a person who was condemned to die would be treated in the normal, scheme of things in the Roman world. But that was not the Jewish custom. And a Jewish custom was something Pilate would need to respect as expected of him, because we know that the Sanhedrists, they brought Jesus over to Pilate because they wanted the death penalty. So definitely he would have to also abide by the Jewish law, the Jewish customs in force. And what was the Jewish custom in force? The biblical injunction of the book of Deuteronomy, which said that no bodies could be left hanging on a tree overnight. So this injunction had to be obeyed. So any Jew who was crucified, even like that person did not have any relatives and all, pious Jews would sometimes come forward and see that the body was, given a common burial, or at least it was thrown in the common grave, whatever the case would be. So if a criminal was put to death by the Jewish court, that is the Sanhedrin, the criminal was buried in a common grave, which allowed relatives to track the body and give it a secondary burial later, maybe a year later. So the Jews were very sensitive to see that this biblical law was not violated. So any criminal, even if he was condemned by their own Jewish court or by the Roman this, they would normally, take pains to see that a body of a Jewish person was not left hanging on a tree. So many scholars, they feel that because this injunction was in place, that must have been the motive for Joseph of Arimathea to come forward and claim Jesus' body, because he was a very pious Jew, because Mark tells us that he looked forward, to the coming of the kingdom. So maybe Mark also tells us that he was a Sanhedrist, he was a member of the council. So definitely scholars, they feel that he was just out of Jewish piety, he felt this was his duty as a good Jew to do this, and he was coming forward, to bury Jesus's body. So they feel that this was the case. But many of these scholars, they contend it was not mere fidelity to biblical injunction. There was something more than all this. Joseph does not put Jesus in a common grave. We know that if he was performing a mere act of Jewish piety, which was expected of pious Jew, he would have, placed Jesus' body in the common grave. But we know that Joseph did not do that. He was given a very decent burial, and not only a decent burial, but a burial that was fit for the aristocratic people, which was normally the case with the aristocratic Jews, the Jewish nobility in Jerusalem. Joseph does not put Jesus in a common grave. He actually gives him a decent burial, which fits Isaiah 53:9. Now, before we go on to that, just here have a small bio of Joseph of Arimathea. From where does he come? All that is known for certain, what we can be absolutely certain about this man is, whatever we know is only born out from the canonical Gospels. He was born at Arimathea, and that's how he is known as Joseph of Arimathea. And Arimathea is a place that is identified with the ancient city of Ramathaim Zophim. Now, this was a place which has a very strong connection, considered to be the birthplace of the prophet Samuel in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, the birthplace of Samuel is referred to as Ramah. So, Ramathaim Zophim was this ancient city, which was actually known as Arimathea at the time of Jesus. Although many scholars prefer to identify Arimathea as a town called Ramallah, but which is not really the case. He was a wealthy Israelite, Matthew tells us. Luke tells us he was a good and a just man, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, as Mark, mentions us, and scholars think that he was a very pious Jew, though he was a member of the Sanhedrin. He is also called by Mark and by Luke as Boletus, means Boletrion was another word for the Sanhedrin in Greek. So, literally speaking, a sort of a council member, senator. Thus, he was a member of the Sanhedrin, so was Sanhedrist, the court. He was also a secret disciple of Jesus. John tells us about this, that he was a secret disciple of Jesus, probably ever since Jesus first preaching in Judea. We get this, detail only from the Gospel of John. And we know that John wrote his account much, much later, many decades later after Mark. Mark generally is believed to have been written, before the fall of the temple around 68 AD. But today scholars are coming to a consensus that probably Mark could have been as early as, in the 50s, early 50s. So we never know. So early on when the traditions were gathered, these things might have been missed out, which later on would have been filled up by the evangelist John. So John tells us that he was a secret disciple of Jesus, which is not, mentioned by any other evangelist. So on account of the secret allegiance to Jesus, we can safely inform he did not consent to his condemnation by the Sanhedrin. So definitely when Jesus was being tried in the Sanhedrin at his trial, we can be sure that maybe even if Joseph was there, along with maybe Nicodemus also was a member of the council, and many others, because their names are not provided. But that, since those names are not mentioned, we cannot simply argue out of silence that nobody else was there. There were probably many Sanhedrists who were, sympathetic to the views of Jesus. So likely that, Joseph could have either been absent, during the final condemnation when Jesus was being condemned to die by the Sanhedrin, or he might have been there and his voice subdued, because they were a minority voice probably. Mark tells us that he boldly approached Pilate, a very important detail. Why does Mark use this word, he boldly approached Pilate? Why did he need such courage to approach Pilate? We sometimes never think about it, and there was a very deep reason behind it. So Mark, in passing, just, gives that, sort of a dart, but we need to take a few steps behind and reflect on this as to why Joseph was required to muster courage to approach the governor. Of course, to go to the governor, it is like, normally as normal citizens, none of us will think like we can just have access to the prime minister or the chief minister's office. So it is something like that. So just going to the governor entailed a lot of, risk. And what was the risk that was involved? Let us have a look. It's crucial to remember that Joseph is not a family member. So for Joseph, it would be okay if a family member approached, they were allowed to take custody of the crucified man's body. But Joseph is not a family member. So for Joseph to ask for Jesus' body is to publicly identify himself as a sympathizer of a man just executed for high treason. This was very risky business. You are coming to the governor, okay, who has condemned your friend to death. He has been, declared an enemy of the state, and you are also likely to be viewed in the same light. So it was very, very risky. So it would be seen as an act against the emperor. So Jesus was condemned for high treason. Mestas was the charge that was brought against him. An enemy of the state, an enemy of Caesar. So under Roman law, this was a charge. So hence, Joseph stood in very great danger of being viewed as a sympathizer of an enemy of state, and likely could, have been arrested on the same charge. Of course, we know that Pilate, was very much convinced that the Sanhedrists were all, they had all contrived to frame charges and see that Jesus was finally executed. Of course, we know that Pilate knew, but we never could be very certain about it. We are just, these are guesses that we normally make. So his riches, we know that Joseph was a very wealthy man. We have to remember that in the Roman circle, riches also would not save a rich man if he was viewed as an enemy of the state. His riches too would not have saved him, because we know that Roman governors not only, Pilate was not so much, but the other governors definitely everywhere in the other provinces and all were very rapacious men. What is the meaning of rapacious? Very men who are, willing to tear you down in order to have all your possessions. So many Roman governors were known to be rapacious in condemning rich aristocrats. For what reason? Because when they did that, the property of that aristocrat or the nobleman would, automatically be confiscated and would be added to the possessions of the Roman governor. So even his riches would not, definitely save Joseph of Arimathea. Had such an action, had to come if he, if the governor had to, turn finicky and question as to why you come, and if he was viewed as a sympathizer and later condemned. So this was a risk that was involved in Joseph coming forward, because his riches would definitely not save him. So it is very interesting to, bring this thought to our mind. And so here in Joseph Arimathea, we have a rich man who made it through the eye of the needle. Remember what Jesus said about that young man? It is very difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. No, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle, but for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. So here we have a counter example of Joseph of Arimathea. Despite being a very wealthy man, he did finally make it, through the eye of the needle which Jesus talked about. We know from historical records that Herod Antipas, the one who had beheaded John the Baptist and unlawfully married Herodias. You remember this man, Herod Antipas, the tetrarch? Okay, the wife he married Herodias, who was the wife of his brother, and finally Salome dances and asks for the head of John the Baptist. This man, along with his wife Herodias, he lost his entire tetrarchy. He was a tetrarch, ruler of only 1/4 of Palestine. But they became super ambitious, and at the insistence of his wife Herodias, who was a very greedy woman, she compelled him and forced him, and we know very well that Herod Antipas was a very weak person. So he gave in. Okay, he gave in to the demands of Herodias and went asking of all the people. Emperor Caligula, who was himself a very mad man, we know that, went to Caligula asking, okay, that he should be made king. And what did Caligula do? He was instantly exiled. He lost his tetrarchy. He lost, okay, his kingdom, or whatever, okay, we can call the small kingdom over which he presided over. He lost everything, and he went into exile with his wife, where he finally died somewhere in the western part of the provinces. So why Emperor Caligula ordered him to be sent into exile? Because his act of asking to be made king was viewed as treason. So you see how heavy the charge of Maestas was. Okay, an enemy of state or whatever, that was something that you could end up losing your life. But unmindful of the personal danger he stood in, Joseph mustered courage to make the bold request to Pilate to hand him over Jesus' body, and fortunately was successful in his request. The crucifixion of Jesus, his master, okay, we can also surmise very safely that he most likely might have been an eyewitness to it, that is the crucifixion of Jesus. Remember, the members of the Sanhedrin were there, most of them mocking, but Joseph might have been, aside and witnessing all this. That's how he knew instantly when Jesus died, and he goes to ask for the body of Jesus. So when he saw the crucifixion of his master, he had been all this while a secret disciple. Why? Because he must have been afraid of the Sanhedrin members. But now, seeing the way Jesus has died, his faith and love for his master is solidified, and this action of Jesus dying on the cross inspires him to provide for Jesus' burial before the Sabbath begins. And we have a very beautiful testimony in the Gospel of Peter, which is considered to be the apocryphal Gospel. This Gospel in particular mentions him as a friend of Pilate, a very strange detail. We don't know, we can't be very sure whether really he was a friend of Pilate, because many of the things that are mentioned in the Gospel of Peter, there is a lot of made up stuff, and that's how we did not end up going in the New Testament canon. Mark doesn't mention that it was his own tomb. Okay, that is a tomb he had prepared for himself. I mean, Joseph of Arimathea. But how else would he be able to arrange for a tomb of this grandeur so fast in that area? So we can very safely surmise that this must have been a tomb which he himself must have prepared for himself. Why? Because this was a normal custom among the nobility of Jerusalem. Okay, they would prepare for their own burial by carving out burial chambers, or a tomb for themselves, and this was something that the rich people in Jerusalem would do it. So you would have rock cut caves all over around the hills surrounding Jerusalem. So Joseph of Arimathea most likely had a tomb prepared for his own burial, which was a custom amongst the Jerusalem's nobility, to have their burial caves hewn into the hills around Jerusalem as part of their eschatological belief in the coming Messiah. They felt, we have already discussed this earlier, the Jews, pious Jews, they had this belief that if they were buried very close to Jerusalem, when the Messiah came, he would come first to Jerusalem, and when the resurrection took place, they were the first among, the people who would come into the resurrection of the Messiah. So with this belief, most of the caves would be, cut into the soft rock, because most of the hills around Jerusalem is made of limestone, which is very soft rock and it's easy to cover. So he must have planned ahead and was ready for his death. So we get this insight from Matthew. Matthew tells us it was his own tomb. When he says, okay, Matthew 27 verse 60 tells us, in his new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock, and he rolled a large stone against the door of the mouth and departed. So this is the way Joseph of Arimathea, along probably with Nicodemus, which John tells us, okay, they must have been the two men who gave this burial to Jesus. He was preparing a burial for his own death, but when he saw his master's need, he quickly and willingly laid Jesus in his own tomb, where no one had ever lain before. This must have been his great token of the love and devotion he bore his master. Once in possession of the sacred treasure, that is the body of Jesus, he, together with Nicodemus, mentioned in John, who brought abundant costly spices weighing almost 100 pounds. The amount of costly spices that were brought by Nicodemus. Remember when Mary of Bethany, when she brought that costly nard, what was the reaction of Judas and all? Okay, a year's salary, 300 denaries it would have cost, and it was barely a few pounds. So you can very well imagine 100 pounds in weight, okay, spices, pure nard and all the others that were normally used for the burial of a rich man. This was the type of funeral burial that was given to Jesus. Wrapped up Jesus' body in fine linen and grave bands, laid it in his own new virgin rock-cut tomb in a neighboring garden, and withdrew after rolling a great stone to the opening of the sepulchre. This is the common thing that is mentioned in all the four gospel accounts, okay? And I have highlighted fine linen and grave bands because from the studies of the shroud, we know that the linen that was used to wrap the body of Jesus, if we believe the shroud of Turin to be the burial cloth of Jesus, it was a very fine quality linen, because linen could be afforded only by the rich, not by the poor. And so to also rock cut tombs were only for the rich people. It was not meant for the poor people, couldn't afford to have that type of burial caves for themselves. So this fine linen, we know, when the studies have been done on the shroud, partly, okay, this linen could have come from India. Okay, I will be sharing all these things during the resurrection in the next episode. But this is one thing that we can keep in our mind. So Joseph ensured Jesus got a decent, in fact a rich burial. Thus was fulfilled Isaiah's prediction that the grave of the Messiah would be with a rich man. Isaiah 53 verse 9. This is the verse. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich. The Eastern Church celebrates the feast of Joseph of Arimathea on 31st July, the Eastern Church, and the Western Roman Catholic Church celebrates the feast of Joseph of Arimathea on 17th of March, which I'm sure many of us are not even aware, okay, that he is celebrated as a saint in both the churches, the Eastern and the Western Church as well, but on different dates. This is a famous painting, okay, I just put out for you. It was done during the Renaissance, okay, by Giovanni Girolamo Savoldo. A very beautiful picture which is currently in the Cleveland Museum of Art in the United States. The last this I'm sharing out, these are the sites finally where Jesus was buried. Neither this, okay, this was the Praetorium, okay, the Fortress Antonia was somewhere here, okay, here you can see the Fortress Antonia. We know that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is over here, okay, definitely. And this 100% today archaeologists have confirmed that this is the burial site of Jesus. So Jesus was probably taken, okay, first many of the scholars surmise that this was a Praetorium. He was condemned, he was scourged here, then probably he was led from here, and then he was taken. But this is not likely the Via Dolorosa, okay, the way of the cross. though this is the way of the cross that is celebrated is supposed to be this. Okay, the traditional Via Dolorosa is from the Fortress Antonia. It begins and ends up here at the correct side, the side to the Holy Sepulchre. But neither this has been the route, nor okay, this has been the route. Okay, nor this has been the route. The correct route has been here. It was from the Praetorium here. This was taken here. Okay, Jesus went around over here and then here. The whole problem why this was proposed was, at the time of Jesus, this place, Golgotha, was outside the city walls. But later on, after Jesus died, and somewhere around 44 BC and beyond, okay, the northern wall of Jerusalem was built over here. So everyone knew that crucifixion would always take outside the city walls. So this became a very confusing factor. The northern wall that was built by Agrippa, okay, much later, not by Herod Agrippa II, and started by Agrippa I but carried on by Agrippa II. So this northern wall, okay, because of this, they thought that this must have been, okay, the way it was carried on, but that is not the case. And today there's consensus that this was the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross actually, and you just hear Golgotha was the place where Jesus was crucified. Okay. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the entrance to it, which is over here at Golgotha. This is the site. Okay. This is from National Geographic. This is the most reliable map. Okay, so it gives you, this was the northern wall that created all the trouble, the understanding. So this was what was built by Herod Agrippa, but much later, years after Jesus had been put to death. So this was the confusing thing. So they thought that probably the place of Jesus's crucifixion would lie beyond these walls, but that has not been the case. This is the correct one. So we come to the end of our session. Coming Sunday, we will do about the resurrection and a summary of the Gospel of Mark and the ending of Mark's Gospel, which is very important for us to know. The true ending and the added verses to the Gospel. Any questions?